Hello, Mr. President. I guess I'm here to brief you on the current situation in the Middle East. I have chosen to focus on briefing you on the events of the Arab Spring and their relationship to American foreign policy and American relations in the region. The four countries I specifically chose to focus on are Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and Libya. Each of these countries have had their own variation of the Arab Spring revolutions in them, and very different manifestations, different levels of violence, different levels of democracy. But all things considered, it's a very telling example of what we're dealing with and a very good subject sample that would be focused on. First country I chose to focus on was Tunisia. Tunisia is a small Arab nation in the Mediterranean and northern Africa with a population of about 11 million. And this country is where a little over a year ago, or a little under a year ago, pardon me, the Arab Spring revolutions began with a disenfranchised, disgruntled fruit salesman committed an act of self-immolation in front of the local government. This act of defiance against a government that was seen as unjust and unlawful conflagrated and turned into the entire major revolution. By mid-January, I believe, Zine Ben Ali, who was the dictator of Tunisia, the long-standing military dictator of Tunisia, was evicted from power in a bloodless coup, and since then, Tunisia sort of has been the ideal for an Arab Spring revolution, or one of the ideals, very bloodless, very peaceful transition of power. Um, in the current situation, very recently, the first real democratic elections in the Middle East have taken place, with a moderate Islamist party taking power, and it was the excuse me, I'm having some difficulty pronouncing it. Ennahda movement, which is a moderate Islamist movement, has taken power in Tunisia's current government, which was previously banned under Ben Ali's administration. Tunisia probably doesn't affect American foreign policy as much as the other Arab nations, simply because it's not as oil rich and it's not as major an oil producer, nor is it as major a counterterrorism outpost that we could use. But at the same time, the impact of the Tunisia revolutions, of the people in Tunisia, is far-reaching and should not be underestimated under any circumstances. The second Arab nation that I focused on, which also happens to be the face of the Arab Spring Revolution, is the nation of Egypt, which underwent its own revolution early February and the beginning of March. And this revolution was a predominantly peaceful uprising, peaceful upheaval of autocrat Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power for 30 years. It was the peaceful revolution, much like Tunisia. Very little violence. It was essentially a bloodless overthrow. And since then, Egypt has remained one of the most interesting situations. Among other things, Hosni Mubarak, first in terms of the United States, Hosni Mubarak was a longtime ally of the United States, who was a fairly moderate influence in terms of countering Islamic terrorism, countering foreign terrorism, and working in tune with the United States' Middle Eastern aspirations. What will come ever since Hosni Mubarak has been deposed remains to be seen. The situation on the ground in Egypt, however, is a little more fragile. After Mubarak was overthrown, the military took control, and this comes into play later. Between this, there were riots and this sectarian violence between Egypt's large Coptic Christian minority and predominantly Sunni Muslim majority, and so that led to a lot of chaos, a lot of factionalism, but also a lot of cohesion and togetherness, showing that this nation could pull through. Most recently, and most troublingly, there have been large-scale protests against military rule by Egyptians who protested 8 months earlier against Mubarak, saying that the transition to democratic rule is not quick enough, also saying that the military rule is a junta, and that the elections that are coming up are a sham. Whether the elections are a sham or not, we will have to wait till the results of the elections and how the military handles the results of those elections to be seen. But Egypt is currently a large question mark in the Middle East. Whether or not another revolution will become necessary, whether or not change will become necessary, whether or not Egypt is on the right course, as I said, remains to be seen. But at the moment, Egypt is really the fundamental example of how you want a revolution to be dealt with, how you think that a society should change its power, the changing of the guard, and it is a very interesting situation for the United States that the United States does need to tread carefully for, because to lose Egypt would be to lose the most powerful, the most stable, the most economically strong uh, North African nation, North African Arab nation, and would also be a disaster in terms of foreign policy. The third country is Libya, the third North African Mediterranean nation. And Libya is a very, very different scenario on the ground from Tunisia and Egypt, where Tunisia and Egypt were both fairly peaceful overthrows, demonstrators in the streets being supported by the military, who were autocrats and not totalitarian rulers, overthrowing their rulers. Libya was very different. From the get-go, dictator Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, attempted to squash the protesters at every turn. And this led to immense international backlash against Gaddafi. So with Gaddafi, when he began to fire on protesters and began to attack protesters. And after this happened, you began to see mass defections from Gaddafi's regime to the rebels to defend the protesters. There were lots of soldiers who would defect, lots of Air Force men and higher ups too, who would defect and defend the general populace from Gaddafi. I keep wanting to call him Mubarak, but around the same time in the spring, the United Nations and NATO passed a resolution condemning Libya, as well as enacting a no-fly zone over the country, and making sure that Gaddafi could not run air missions against his civilian population, and severely limiting Gaddafi's military capabilities, basically providing an air net for the resistance fighters. And since then, the resistance has made incredible gains on the ground, taking Tripoli, taking almost all of Egypt, or Libya, excuse me, and the war really, against Gaddafi at least, ended in the town of Sirte, which was Gaddafi's hometown. When it was taken, Gaddafi was found and executed by rebel fighters, and that officially ended this stage of the Libya conflict. What will come out of Libya once again remains to be seen, as it's a fragile situation with a lot of different interests that have been repressed under Gaddafi, jostling for power. But at the moment, the civil war is over, and violence is, by large, over. And what this means to America is much like the rest of the Arab Spring, who will come to power in Libya. Because Libya is a very valuable nation, massive oil reserves, massive energy reserves, as well as a strategic country, which has been heavily involved in both the fight against terrorism and fighting for international terrorism. And how Libya changes will certainly affect America. The final nation I chose, which is the only really unfinished fight against a despot, is the current fight in Syria. And what all three of the initial revolutions had in common is that they were successful in their early aim. All three of the dictators of these Arab nations have been deposed. This is not the scenario in Syria. There is currently a brutal struggle between the autocrat Bashar Assad's forces and the Free Syrian Army, as they're calling themselves, who are mostly Syrian military defectors who will be protecting anti-government, anti-administration protesters. And like I said, the situation on the ground is much more murky than Libya. There is no unified resistance the way there was in Libya. There are no higher-ups defecting from Assad's administration to the resistance. And it has been a fairly brutal suppression, something the Assads are fairly well accustomed to, as Bashar's father was responsible for killing over 30,000 people in the city of Hama in the early 80s. I believe it was 30,000. I'm not sure if my numbers are correct there, but committing massacres in the 1980s against Islamists. But the scenario in Syria has changed on the ground dramatically, especially since earlier last week, or sometime in the past 2 weeks, the Arab League passed unilateral sanctions against the Syrian government, the Syrian people, making sure that they can't do commerce and trying to cut them off to see if Assad will negotiate with the anti-government protesters. How this will affect Syria remains to be seen, if it'll damage the economy more and force Syria into a compromise with the protesters, or whether or not it will harden Syria's resolve and make them move even stronger and even more heavy-handedly against the protesters remains to be seen. For America and foreign policy, and for foreign policy in general geopolitics, Syria is a linchpin in the Transjordan Syria area. It borders on 5 different nations, and a stream of refugees could easily destabilize countries that are already unstable, like Lebanon or Jordan. And on top of that, the Assad regime has managed to keep a tenuous peace with Israel, and it's unknown how a popular Syrian regime would react to Israel, whether or not violence against Israel would resume. And that remains to be seen, whether or not how it will react to Assad being out of power, and how Assad, even if he does remain in power, how he will react, because he was seen as a fairly modern ruler, but now it's becoming clear that he's a fairly brutal ruler, and how Assad will be going into the future remains to be seen. If there's one thing for certain about these Arab Spring revolutions, it is, while it may sound cliche, that nothing is certain. We're not sure where the future will go with these movements. We're not sure where they'll move, what direction they will go in. And because of that, they are a very frightening thing to the United States foreign policy, because while other nations do deserve democracy, what will happen to the United States' interest, to its civilians, to its foreign policy, and to its allies remains to be seen from all these Arab Spring nations. And all we can do now is wait, hope for the best, try and support grassroots democracy where it emerges so we can sow the seeds of support for America. But really, the only thing we have to do now is bide our time and really hope for the best. I'm Alex.